proposed instruction that has been submitted to me by Mr. Albee. And it reads, on Friday, Dr. Mainland was asked questions regarding whether Aaron Dillard's statements regarding Julie Jensen's consumption of antifreeze were inconsistent with Dr. Mainland's conclusions. The court should not have commented on whether Mr. Dillard's statements were inconsistent with Dr. Mainland's testimony. It is for you, the jury, alone to determine the facts, to determine what inferences should be drawn from those facts, and to determine what weight to give to those facts and inferences. Did you want to say anything further?
I had asked Dr. Mainland about whether some statements of Aaron Dillard were inconsistent with her conclusions. I thought she had answered that initially, yes. I was probing that further, and at some point the court jumped in and told the jury the difference between inconsistent and incomplete, and which I think Dr. Mainland was sort of about to do, but giving the courts, I thought it suggested to the jury potentially the court's view that it was more incomplete than inconsistent, and that concerned me, because I believe it's inconsistent would be more appropriate. Maybe it's incomplete. Maybe it's, it's not something I would say is not subject to reasonable dispute, but I worry about it when the court seems to be on this, potentially be viewed as on one side of that dispute on a factual issue.
Thank you. Did you want to respond?
I had no recollection of the incident, Your Honor, and even now that it's being described, I don't perceive that there was anything improper about the court. You have a superintending responsibility to explain things to some extent to the jury as we're going along. It's not been my impression that you've been one-sided in this respect. You've explained some things when I've been examining witnesses as well. So I think it's incorrect to say that the court erred, or the court should not have commented on it. I think that, to paraphrase another famous exchange, you're not a potted plant. You have a responsibility to discharge as the presiding judge. I didn't see a problem with it, and honestly, I didn't even remember it. I doubt the jury remembers it, but maybe they do. Maybe they've got a better memory than I do.
Well, I don't recall what the exact question was, so I'm at a little bit of a disability, but I would tell you that I'm going to risk summarizing what I think happened, as I think you referred to an answer as being inconsistent, and not in an inquisitorial form, asking a question, but rather in a declarative sense. And maybe I'm wrong about this, but in any event, I felt it was necessary that the jury understand that there are inconsistent statements, and as you aptly point out, there are incomplete statements. And the example I think I gave was if there was an accident down on the corner, and I told you that it was between a Chevy or a Ford and a Pontiac.
Now remember.
I wouldn't be subject to impeachment later, I don't think it would be inconsistent later if you asked me what color it was for me to say it was a red Pontiac. That's not inconsistent. Now, there are some things that are so glaringly absent from a description that they become inconsistent. For example, if you asked me, well, who was driving the Pontiac, and I said an elephant, one would have expected that my initial statement would have included the statement that there was an elephant driving the Pontiac. But as to some other factor that would not stand out, then it becomes an incomplete statement. So I disagree with your analysis, and I certainly am not going to give this instruction because I do not think it was inappropriate for me to make the comment which I did, yeah, go ahead.
And just to be clear, I don't think the court's statement of there being a difference between inconsistent and incomplete was inaccurate. I mean, I think that's true. I just feel that that's something that if the DA wants to make that argument in closing or something like that, that's the time for it, and it's their argument.
Well, the other thing that I think need to be said is that when I made the remark, I think I said doctor has already alluded to this and not being inconsistent, and I might also state that afterwards, doctor said I had taken the words right out of her mouth, so I think it's harmless error because apparently it was going to be forthcoming anyway. So your request is denied. Anything else before we start?
No, Your Honor. I think what we left off is that I'm going to start the redirect examination of Dr. Mainland. Is that?
I believe that's correct. Yeah. All right. Ask the jury to come in, please.
Please be seated.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I hope you had all it's Monday. I hope you all had a wonderful weekend, and let's proceed with the case. Mr. Chambliss, you're going to redirect.
Thank you, Your Honor. And Doctor, I don't honestly remember if I went into this at all on direct examination on Friday. So just to ensure that, and I'm sure counsel will object if I did, but did we explain to the jury, or did you describe to the jury the stages that a person goes through as they're experiencing ethylene glycol poisoning?
We talked about the stages, but I don't think I explained them explicitly, like you would read them in a book or anything.
Well, can you describe to the jury the stages that a person goes through as they're experiencing ethylene glycol poisoning?
Sure. Ethylene glycol it's a small molecule. It's an alcohol. It's just it's just a little bit bigger than beverage alcohol. And when you consume it, the first effect it has is on the central nervous system, which includes the brain. Well, the brain's the biggest part. And the commonly quoted time frame of, being able to see effects of, this is called stage 1, is from 30 minutes to 12 hours. During this stage 1 of intoxication with ethylene glycol, the person will act like they're drunk. This is a clue if somebody shows up to the hospital acting drunk, but yet they have no odor of alcohol on their breath, that maybe ethylene glycol could be a factor. So they can act inebriated, they can lack coordination, they can be dizzy, lightheaded, stumbling around. If, the more that is consumed, the quicker the symptoms will show up and the more severe they will be. So in stage 1, you can have coma, seizures, and even death. Stage 2, in the books, begins 12 to 24 hours after ingestion, and that's called the cardiorespiratory phase. By this point, the parent compound, ethylene glycol, is being broken down by the body into its breakdown products or metabolites, which are very toxic. The two that we pay most attention to are glycolic acid, glycolic, and oxalic acid. The oxalic acid gets into the bloodstream, and the body, if the dose is high enough, the body is unable to compensate for that excess acid, because you may know the body has to function within a very small range of acidity or non-acidity. The symptoms include rapid, heavy breathing, and perhaps the heart racing. The heart can go into arrhythmia. And these are just the body trying to get rid of this acid. Severe acidosis can also produce coma, and people who die in acidosis die mostly in a coma. The third stage of poisoning is said to range from 24 to 72 hours after ingestion. That's called the renal or kidney phase. And this is when the other metabolite of ethylene glycol, oxalic acid, starts to exert its effect on the kidneys. Oxalic acid combines with calcium that's normally in the blood and produces calcium oxalate crystals, of which we've been speaking at length. And as you know, those crystals get deposited in the tubules of the kidney and they disturb kidney function. And that's a summary of the stages. I think we mentioned this Friday already. Stages can overlap. You may have one that's not clinically apparent. The more you ingest, the more likely things are going to appear faster, because it's all a function of how much you take and how long your body has to deal with it.
Now, doctor, in the course of your examination of the investigative file in this case, did you encounter descriptions of Julie Jensen's conditions or symptoms that she was manifesting in the last days of her life?
Yes.
Okay. Tell us about and who was the principal source of this information?
The principal source was Mark Jensen in conversations with both the first responders at the scene and with Paul Griffin, Julie's brother. Another source is Julie Jensen's son.
So, and then there was a conversation that Julie Jensen had on December 2nd, right, with her next door neighbor?
That's correct.
Now, putting all those things together, doctor, what was the picture that emerged for you in terms of Julie Jensen's condition in the last 3 days of her life and how she was manifesting symptoms during the last 3 days of her life?
Well, she started to exhibit symptoms if what the defendant described. She started to exhibit symptoms in the evening or overnight hours between December 1st and 2nd.
December 1st was a Tuesday?
Yes.
Okay.
So between Tuesday and Wednesday.
Now, what was the description that the defendant had provided that would cause you to conclude that she was manifesting symptoms at that early stage?
She was described as acting loopy, giddy, and drunk.
At what time?
This was around 2 in the morning.
Of December 2nd.
Yes.
Now, that condition that's being described at 2 o'clock in the morning on Wednesday, December 2nd, what inference do you draw in terms of when the first dose of ethylene glycol was administered based upon that description?
Based upon that description alone, I would put it between 30 minutes and 12 hours previous, based on that description alone.
And then what were other descriptions that you heard of Julie Jensen's condition between that point and up to the time of her death on December 3rd?
There was reference made to her trying to get up on Wednesday morning, December 2nd, and use the bathroom, where she was still acting drunk and uncoordinated, and couldn't walk a straight path. She was. It sounds as though she went back to bed and started sleeping. And if I recall right, her son reported that morning she already had started breathing rapidly and heavily. So we're talking, she's into the second phase of the poisoning here. She reportedly slept most of the day on Wednesday.
Reported by whom?
By the defendant.
To whom? Who did you say that to?
To Paul Griffin.
And what else did the defendant then say about Julie Jensen's condition that influences your evaluation of this case?
He says that she was thirsty. And he also says that she was vomiting. She couldn't keep anything down.
At what time?
On Wednesday. during the day.
Now, you indicated that the statements you've heard indicate that Julie was sleeping on Wednesday?
Yes.
And did you see any statements from the defendant indicating at what point it was that he went to Dr. Borman to obtain a prescription for Ambien, a sleeping pill?
I don't know what time it was, but I think it was in the morning.
And did you hear any further descriptions from the defendant concerning Julie Jensen's condition and her behaviors on Thursday morning, the morning of her death?
Yes.
What did he say about Julie's condition on the morning of her death?
Well, he described that her breathing was very heavy and raspy, and she was very out of it. She couldn't speak. She could only sort of grunt. She couldn't sit up in bed by herself, and she had to be propped up so her sons could see her before they left for school. If I left anything out, I'll add it later.
Now then, you heard Erin Dillard's description that she had started to improve on Thursday afternoon, correct?
Yes.
Now, is there anything about the course of the symptoms that have been described up to this point by the defendant that would cause you to think that it's possible that that her breathing could have improved on Thursday afternoon? Explain to the jury how that could have happened, if, in your estimation, it could have.
It could have been because she had, already passed through that second phase of poisoning, and she was getting ready to die.
Now, on cross-examination, you had expressed or you had agreed with the assertion that it's possible that Erin Dillard could have made this whole thing up, right?
I think I was asked that.
And you agreed with that, didn't you? Can you explain to the jury how Erin Dillard could have made up the story that Mark Jensen sat on Julie's chest, shoved her face and neck into a pillow and smothered her, how he could have made that up and caused in such a way as to cause it to correspond as precisely as it did to the physical evidence in this case?
I can't imagine how he would be able to do that.
I want to direct your attention again to the exhibit depicting the rib cage of Julie Jensen. Can you turn on this thing? I'll try here. Let's see, I think it's on now. Thank you. Now, and I know you used a laser pointer the other day, but it seems to me it's easier if you just get up and you just point. If a pen will help you or something. But could you point to precisely where these injuries are that you're talking about on the rib cage of Julie Jensen?
I'm not tall enough. I need something longer.
You need something longer. Well, how about, I can't hold you up, so.
It's rib
Just
two.
tell me where to stop. Is it right?
No. There's one end of it.
Right here. It goes this way?
There, stop.
Okay, right here. That's one part of it. And that's on, which rib is that?
That's number 2.
Okay. And then it proceeds down here. This is rib number 3?
Yes.
And tell me when to stop.
There.
Right here is where it starts? And then where does it stop?
There.
Right here.
A little farther back.
Right here?
Out there.
So whatever is causing this bruise is coming down this way and this way. And then down here, where would I start?
Actually, we've got a few kind of discrete areas. There's around here,
Right in here.
around here, and in there.
So it kind of starts here and ends over here.
Yes.
And are there any other injuries, or is that it that you saw?
That's all I can see in that picture. And that's all that was described.
Now, what I want you to do, using your left arm, put your left arm across the same place on your rib cage where that would line up with those injuries. And
Something like that.
And doctor, when you saw, and it's hard to put your arm in that position, isn't it? It'd be easier if you're laying down, perhaps. But,
Yes.
and I'd request the record show that the witness is holding. Actually, that was your right arm, wasn't it? Or it's your left arm holding. She was holding her left arm.
Something like that.
Yeah, she was holding her left arm, with the arm pointed almost straight down and over to the. By straight, I mean the arm is straight, and it's over to the right side of the body, coming out about where the hip is. Would that be about right?
Fair enough.
I would say at least. Did you want to agree with the characterization, or?
No, I missed some of it.
Well, I think the jury saw it, and I think it's been fairly described, although there's a disagreement between Mr. Gemways and I about the final.
I'll go along with your description, Judge. Now, how does the manner in which you just held your arm in front of the jury, how well does that correspond to the manner in which Julie Jensen's arm is splayed out beneath her there in this photo?
I think I approximated it pretty well.
And this is Exhibit S12. So how could Aaron Dillard have known that, unless Mark Jensen told him?
Well, objection calls for speculation from this witness.
Well, let's put it this way. You, doctor, when you looked at the autopsy report, and you'd seen this photo before, correct?
Yes.
You'd never linked up those injuries to the rib cage to the way this arm was, had
No.
you? Until you heard of Aaron Dillard's statement.
True.
And then you compared them,
Yes.
and they line up perfectly.
They line up very well.
And with respect to the injuries to the hypopharyngeal, was that a muscle or a gland or whatever it is?
Mucosa.
Mucosa.
Soft tissue.
And here, I'll stand with my back to the jury. Could you point right to where that would be on the back of my neck?
Oh, jeez. Let's say, stick your head up straight.
Okay.
Okay. Well,
So about halfway between the base of my skull and the top of my shoulders. Is that about right?
yeah, sounds good.
Okay. So the injuries to the hypopharyngeal mucosa of Julie Jensen would be consistent if somebody were sitting on her with their left arm shoving her neck and head.
Objection to the leading.
Well, would it be consistent or inconsistent with somebody, with a person like Mark Jensen sitting on Julie Jensen's rib cage and using his left hand to shove her neck and face into that pillow?
I don't know which hand he was using, but it would be consistent.
Well, let's think about that. If he's sitting on her, his left arm would be toward her head, and his right arm would be toward her buttock, correct? Unless he reached over like this.
Yeah, that's one potential explanation.
And when you had previously described the cause of death in this case as being ethylene glycol poisoning, that description really didn't explain, or that conclusion didn't really explain these other assorted injuries to Julie Jensen's body.
No.
Did it? And the description of Julie Jensen's homicide as provided to Aaron Dillard, allegedly provided to Aaron Dillard by Mark Jensen, does explain those criteria, doesn't it?
Yes.
And have you ever heard of any other explanation into the circumstances surrounding Julie Jensen's death that explains the injuries to the hypopharyngeal mucosa and explains the injuries to the rib cage in the manner in which Aaron Dillard's description does?
No. Except for what I said myself in testimony.
Okay. Now, Doctor, we're now hearing of 2 contributing factors to the death of Julie Jensen.
Correct.
And explain the interrelationship between these two circumstances that you believe led to Julie Jensen's death.
I believe that she was poisoned with ethylene glycol. She was very near death, and she was finished off
How was she finished off?
by smothering,
And how did the smothering occur, based on what you can see in this case?
by somebody putting pressure on her from above.
Like sitting on her chest,
That would work.
while shoving her face into the pillow using the...
Objection to the leading.
Well, be as specific as you can about the manner in which Julie Jensen was asphyxiated. Given what you see of the physical evidence, I want you to recreate as accurately and in as detailed a manner as you can the likely last several seconds of Julie Jensen's life.
I believe that somebody was sitting on top of her back and shoving her head and neck into the pillow.
Until she stopped breathing.
Yes.
And how long would that take for a person in Julie Jensen's condition?
It could take minutes.
I saw, the photograph depicts that Julie Jensen's right eye was wide open, correct?
It was partly open.
Does that mean that Julie Jensen was conscious or awake at the time that she was being asphyxiated?
No.
What does that mean, if anything, or does it mean anything at all?
It really doesn't mean anything. You see that in deceased people quite frequently.
Do you see that in people who die in their sleep?
Yes.
Okay. Doctor, in the course of your examination of this file, you had heard of an incident that had occurred in early November where Julie Jensen had become ill and vomited around the house?
Yes.
And could that have been consistent with an earlier attempt at ethylene glycol poisoning?
Yes.
If Julie had been poisoned with ethylene glycol in November of 1998, early November of 1998, could that account for some of the crystals that were still in her kidneys at the time of her death on December 3rd, or not?
It's possible. I don't think we know the what do you want to say, the end point. It's been published and demonstrated that crystals can remain in the kidneys for 22 days, and I think that's the longest I've ever seen. I don't know if it could be longer than that or not.
But could it account for all of the crystals in her kidneys?
No.
Now, you were talking about these stages of ethylene glycol poisoning, and you indicated that they tend to overlap. Is that correct?
Yes.
Does the extent to which they overlap, is that a function of the size of the dose or the number of doses, or not? Or both?
It's both, I would say. I think the size of the dose is most important.
In terms of what?
In terms of how quickly symptoms are manifested and how phases may blend together.
Now, Doctor, the opinion that you stated about there being more than one dose of ethylene glycol, is that based exclusively upon the toxicology results in this case, or is it based upon the toxicology results when looked at in the context of the statements that the defendant made regarding Julie Jensen's condition in the last 3 days of her life?
It's based on both of those.
Doctor, based upon the physical symptoms that Julie Jensen was manifesting in the last 3 days of her life, would you as a physician believe that there was any need for Ambien to be prescribed?
No.
You examined Dr. Borman's file on this case?
Yes.
Did you see any indication or any signs in this case of suicidal ideation on the part of Julie Jensen in the weeks and months preceding her death?
Objection.
No.
No, objection, move to strike. It's beyond her expertise. It's not established foundation.
Is this something typically you would do, doctor, to review records of a treating physician, a family practitioner? Family practitioner, is that right?
Yes, sir.
In respect to determining whether there was a history of suicidal ideation?
Absolutely.
The objection's overruled.
So you examined the medical history such as it was provided to you?
Yes.
And you examined the statements of friends and family members of Julie Jensen such as they were provided to you?
Yes.
And did you see any evidence or any indication that Julie Jensen was suicidal in the weeks or months preceding her death?
I object
No.
to, again, the foundation.
Overruled.
This witness.
That means you can answer the question.
Reasonable degree of medical certainty?
To reasonable degree of medical certainty, and the answer was no.
Okay. And explain to the jury why that is. What did you look at, and what lessons or what inferences did you draw from what you were looking at?
Okay, when we look at a death and we're trying to decide whether or not it's suicide, we really go back and look for hard evidence. I mean, sometimes it's obvious. If somebody, if somebody hangs themselves, it's going to be suicide, 99.9% of the time. But, drug cases and overdoses and things like that are more equivocal. And so we look back into the decedent's medical history, if there is any, see if there was any suicide attempt, suicidal ideation, any comments made, regarding if the world would be better off without me or whatever. We look at their medical record. We see if they have been treated for depression or are being treated for depression. We see, I try and look at, I look at everything. I look at the length of treatment, the types of treatment. I take that all into account. I take into account statements by people that were around the decedent prior to death. I take every scrap of history I can into account.
And when you tell us some of the histories that you took into account in this case.
Well, besides Mrs. Jensen's medical history that I got from Dr. Borman's file, there were numerous statements from friends, neighbors, etc., that she was not depressed.
Tell me, Doctor, there was evidence that Julie was pretty upset and pretty distraught, wasn't there?
Overruled.
Yes.
Okay. Can you explain to the jury the difference between somebody being upset and being distraught and unhappy and somebody being depressed?
Well, it might look the same on the surface. Depressed people tend to cry. Distraught people tend to cry. But I know Julie specifically stated to multiple people that she was scared.
Well, withdrawn.
You also saw Julie Jensen's letter, right?
Yes.
Would you be able to see it from there, counsel?
Yes.
It's over there. I see. Thank you. Obviously, this is larger than life size, but does that look like the letter that you examined?
Yes.
Now, did that letter enter into your analysis concerning the cause and manner of death in this case?
Yes, it did.
Could I have the pointer, Judge, the laser pointer? Now, here, you can use the pointer, Doctor.
I've got one here.
Oh, you've got one there, okay. What were the factors, the criteria concerning that letter that influenced your analysis of this case?
Most every sentence in the letter influenced me. I guess the most important one is, where can I find it? I would never take my life because of my kids. They are everything to me.
Now, let's stop right there. That sentence, that declaration, that could be construed as a self-serving declaration. So, I mean, how many mothers say, I'm a lousy mother and I don't like my kids? I mean, every mother pretty much says they love their children, don't they?
I know a few that don't. I said I know a few that don't.
But did you see any evidence in this case that corroborated that declaration? Let's see if I can get this thing to work. That to corroborate the declaration about, I would never take my life because of my kids. They are everything, and the word everything is underlined. They are everything to me. What evidence did you see in this case that corroborated that declaration?
Again, statements by neighbors and other people that observed Mrs. Jensen and her interaction with her children. And I believe she chose to be a stay-at-home mom so she could be with the kids.
You said every sentence, though. Pretty much every sentence influenced you to some extent. So let's go through it sentence by sentence. It starts out, it's addressed to the Pleasant Prairie Police Department. What's the significance of that?
She's crying for help.
But she didn't give it to the police department, and it wasn't to be turned over to them until after she was dead. No. Why would she do that? Do you have any opinion as a medical examiner as to why that would happen?
Judge, I do object.
You would need to lay a foundation that this is something that a medical examiner would routinely form an opinion upon.
Okay. I'll withdraw the question then, Your Honor. Thank you. Let's go to the first sentence.
Judge, as to the whole letter, I don't see where this witness is in better position to evaluate the content than anyone else, and particularly this jury. It's a lay opinion.
Well, I'm inclined to agree with that. I think that it's one thing for the doctor to consider its content and upon a general examination to report those segments that, and she said all of it, but those that particularly influence her opinion. It's quite another for her to go through an interpretative reading, and I don't think that's permissible. So.
Okay, thank you, Your Honor. Well, tell me, Doctor, would you consider that report, that letter, to be a statement which is consistent or inconsistent with suicidal ideation?
It's inconsistent.
And were there other things about Julie Jensen's life and her actions in the last several days of her life that were consistent or inconsistent with suicidal ideation?
And I continue to object to the foundation for this witness's expertise in this area.
Subject to your recross.
Repeat the question, please.
I want to make sure I get it right, so I'll ask the reporter to read it back.
Question, and were there other things about Julie Jensen's life and her actions in the last several days of her life that were consistent or inconsistent with suicidal ideation?
Yes.
Tell us about those things.
She went to the doctor to try and get some help for, I mean, I don't know how much of that decision was hers alone and how much she felt that, she was being pushed to, but she tried to get help. She talked to people in the days before her death. Didn't mention anything about suicide.
In her medical history, did you note that she'd gone for a mammogram in, I think it was October?
Yes.
And is that consistent or inconsistent with somebody who's looking at suicide or profoundly
This
depressed?
witness's expertise on that question.
Again, she's part of her duties and her procedures in determining that which she's obliged by law to determine, which is the cause of death, is to collect all of the evidence and make an interpretive decision about it. And I think that's what she's recounting here, and your objection is overruled.
All I can say is that a mammogram it's preventive medicine. You know, it's a screening test. You know, it's health maintenance. And I guess I can say personally, if I were planning to kill myself,
I did say that I don't want to say
That's not expertise.
Pardon me?
That's not expertise. I mean, it's...
Well, and that's not necessarily
it's logic.
true, because she,
Logical.
obviously, people, as we tell the jurors and will tell the jury, that people rely upon their ordinary experiences, and she can incorporate some degree of her personal experience in reaching decisions about people's
think
motivation.
that's
No, I'm not going to have an
a lay
extended
opinion.
discussion. The objection is overruled, but I do think that, Doctor, you need to confine it as much as possible to reference to how you would look at it as a physician. And I understand you can't divorce that from your experiences in life and your knowledge of what knowledge you've acquired throughout life.
depressed. Okay.
Go on. I'm sorry, go on with your answer then, Doctor. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Chronically depressed people are not as interested in health maintenance as non-depressed people.
And were you aware that in August she went in for a pelvic exam?
Yes.
Now, are pelvic exams something that, I mean, for the benefit of the men and the jury, are pelvic exams something that women find comfortable or uncomfortable?
I don't think many,
Object to relevance.
Overruled.
they've been described as uncomfortable.
What is the purpose to be served in going in for a pelvic exam?
It's another example of health maintenance. You have a pelvic exam, you get a pap smear, you make sure there's, no cervical cancer cooking or no masses or anything else weird going on down there.
Were you aware of the telephone conversation that Julie Jensen initiated with Marion Passetti in her neighborhood, I think right around November 30th, about planting perennials?
Yes.
Now, tell us about how a conversation like that would fit into the notion of whether or not the speaker, if you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, whether that is consistent or inconsistent with suicidal ideation.
I think if she were seriously considering suicide, she might not go through the trouble of planting perennials.
Thank you, Doctor. I don't have any further questions.
Recross.
Excuse me.
Dr. Mainland, you don't treat live patients, true?
No.
Have you ever had a medical practice where you treated live patients?
No.
You've never treated people for psychiatric disorders, right?
Only in my training.
And that was 10 years ago?
Yes.
You haven't had any recent experience doing any counseling, correct?
Giving any counseling, did you say?
Counseling for living patients?
No, I do not counsel living patients.
You don't deal with patients who are alive, who are depressed, correct?
No,
You don't prescribe medication for
No.
patients who are alive and depressed?
no,
You have no occasion to spend substantial time researching suicide?
I don't know what you mean by substantial time, but I look at suicide a lot.
That is, you have cases that appear to be suicide, right?
Yes,
You mentioned like a hanging situation or something like that, correct?
yes,
In terms of witnesses in this case, the only one you ever talked to is Detective Ratsberg, right?
as far as I can recall,
You didn't talk to Paul Griffin yourself?
no,
You didn't talk to Aaron Dillard?
no,
You didn't talk to the first responder, Mr. Wilkinson?
no,
Were you aware that Mr. Wilkinson testified to moving Mrs. Jensen's body
yes,
and that took place before any photographs were taken?
yes,
And that Mr. Wilkinson could not say how the body was put back if it was in the exact same position?
I don't remember that part, I'm sorry.
In the reports you read a report of Officer Riley, correct?
Was he the first one at the scene?
I beg your pardon?
Was Officer Riley the first one at the scene?
Officer Riley testified in this case that he was the first one at the scene.
Okay, I think I did see his report.
He indicated that Mark Jensen was visibly upset, right?
Yes, I remember that.
You read that in the report? He was
Yes.
crying,
Yes,
right? And he's the one who gave some statements regarding, his report reflects some statements by Mark Jensen regarding Julie Jensen's conditions in her last few days of life, right?
yes,
He indicated that she appeared intoxicated, correct?
I think, now you're going into detail, and I think I would have to look at the report myself.
That would be fine.
Okay, I've got it with me if,
Yes, please,
Okay.
please take a look.
okay, I see it here, Dave Wilkinson.
Actually, I'm asking about Officer Riley at the moment.
Okay.
Do you have that report?
Officer Daniel Riley, yeah, this is his report.
Okay. And can you tell me what date your report was printed? It's on the bottom. The same report was printed on different dates, so that would change the page number.
This was printed on 4/28/1999.
Okay, I think then on yours, it's maybe on page, you're going to have to look, because mine was printed in 2002. And my question is, did Mr. Jensen report to Mr. Riley that Julie was acting like she was intoxicated?
I'm gonna need to read for a second here. Yes,
And prior to that, Officer Riley had gotten some medical history from Mark Jensen, correct?
yes,
Mark had told Officer Riley that Julie had been suffering from depression since August, correct?
yes,
And that the reason that he felt that may have triggered her depression was that their youngest son had started preschool, correct?
yes,
You indicated that you were aware from your review of the file that Mrs. Jensen is very attached to her children.
yes,
The youngest child leaving for school, that could trigger some sad feelings and upset true?
It could.
Some parents have a hard time dealing with that kind of separation, correct?
Some do.
A stay-at-home mom may feel like she isn't nearly as useful as she was before.
Possibly.
Mr. Jensen told Mr. Riley, Officer Riley, that Julie had been taking large amounts of aspirin over the past months.
Yes.
He also indicated that she had not been sleeping, correct?
Yes.
And that would be a reason why Ambien might be prescribed by a doctor like Dr. Borman, correct?
If that's the history that was given to the doctor, certainly.
Well, and Julie Jensen had seen Dr. Borman the day before, correct?
She saw Dr. Borman on December 1st.
Dr. Borman's records reflect that he determined she was depressed? Right?
Yes.
He said that she was crying, right?
Okay, now I've got to go look at his thing again because I want to get the words just right. Give me a second. I can't make out the word. It might say crying.
Or tears?
Let's see. I'm not sure.
Is there a reflection that she was miserable,
Yes.
depressed,
Yes.
decreased appetite?
I don't know if I see it in this record, but there was a letter that Dr. Borman wrote shortly thereafter that states that.
As Dr. Borman wrote a letter to Sergeant Ratsberg, correct?
Yes.
And that's where he said that she was miserable.
Yes.
Dr. Borman was sufficiently concerned that he prescribed Paxil, correct?
Yes.
That's an antidepressant.
Yes, it is.
That's an antidepressant known as an SSRI.
Correct.
You're aware that the Federal Drug Administration has issued warnings connected with SSRIs?
Yes, I do.
And the concern of some people is that SSRIs can cause somebody initially, when they take the antidepressant, to get dramatically worse initially, right?
I think that, I'm not sure of the wording of this, the specific wording of the warning, but it's a common enough pattern that people who take not only SSRIs, but any antidepressant, once they start feeling the effect of the medication, it's thought that they actually now have the energy to take their life, whereas before they hadn't.
So that's a concern now that's being told in the last few years to prescribing doctors and psychiatrists about SSRIs, right?
Yes, I believe more in young people than in adults, though.
But there are occasions in adults where this has been seen as well, where somebody's become violent or suicidal as a result of beginning a course of SSRIs, right?
My opinion is that suicides after initiation of treatment with SSRIs have certainly occurred. My personal medical opinion is that the underlying suicidal ideation was already there. I don't think the drugs themselves did it.
Well, that's the concern that's been expressed in some medical quarters, is that it can take people who weren't quite willing to commit suicide and put them over the edge, right?
Correct. I wouldn't phrase it quite that way, but that's fair enough.
And that was Mrs. Jensen's condition, is that she had just begun this course of SSRIs, right?
Yes, 2 days before her death.
Dr. Borman's records reflect that Julie Jensen also reported that she was depressed in September, right?
I don't think he says that she was depressed. He says that she had been in counseling. In counseling and on Prozac. I don't see the word depressed there.
And are you looking at his letter or the September 21st, 1998 records?
I'm looking at the letter.
How about the records? Do they reflect that she reported some depression on September 21st?
Let's see.
If it's there, I don't see it. If you can point it out to me, I would take a look at it.
In September, did she report to Dr. Borman her strong family history of depression?
Hang on now. Yeah, I just found the page and I'm going over it, so
Sure.
give me a second, please. I don't see it. His writing's pretty lousy.
Okay. How about at the top right-hand portion of the page? It says it has her date of birth, correct?
Counsel, can I see which page you're looking at?
921 medical record.
Okay, 921.
Do you see that?
Yes, it's partly cut off, but I see it.
And then it says 40 years old. And then it says something about David tics.
Yes, I can see that.
Okay, and this is in September of 1998. She's reporting David has tics.
Yes.
Then right under that, it says strong family history depression. Abbreviated.
I'm not sure that that's what that means, but it could.
Okay. Part of the problem in trying to determine what Dr. Borman saw is you're having some difficulty reading his handwriting. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I think he got an A in that course in medical school.
Okay.
It's an occupational hazard.
And did you call Dr. Borman to ask him to interpret these notes for you?
No, I did not. I relied on his notes from December and on his letter.
Well, the notes from December are also difficult to read. Is that fair to say?
I had a better time reading them.
You indicated at the outset of your testimony on Friday on direct examination that one thing that a medical examiner will do is interview a person's physician, correct?
Correct, a medical examiner or the medical examiner's staff.
You did not interview Dr. Borman.
No,
You did not ask anyone in your staff to interpret these notes for you, right?
no.
You don't know what Dr. Borman saw in terms of major changes in Julie Jensen between September and December?
I can note some of the changes that he saw.
She lost weight, correct?
Yes,
And that's a symptom of depression, isn't it?
it can be.
That's consistent with depression, right?
Yes,
And just like bruises to the rib, it's consistent with depression, it's consistent with other things too, right?
yes, it can be.
I mean, that's what this word consistent we've been throwing around means. It's not diagnostic of depression, right?
Correct, you'd have to take other things into account.
And just saying those rib injuries aren't diagnostic of being suffocated, those could be caused by numerous things, correct?
In isolation, yes.
Did you review Julie's earlier medical records or counseling records?
I did not have access to any counseling records.
The prosecutor's office never turned over to you any records from Paul DeFazio?
No,
Would it be important to you that Julie Jensen experienced depression sufficient that she was prescribed Prozac in 1990 and 1991?
if had I known that, I certainly would have taken it into consideration.
That's something that may be significant in evaluating suicide risk, true?
Yes,
Would it have been significant to you if Mr. DeFazio's notes reflected that she had a bad childhood?
not necessarily.
Were you aware that Julie Jensen's brother, at age 17, slit his wrists?
I heard references to a suicide attempt.
And sometimes depression and suicide are things that can run in a family, true?
They can.
That's something that you would look at in terms of evaluating suicide risk, true?
I don't know that I would put as much stock on, or stock in that as the decedent's personal history.
But you are aware that is something that clinical psychiatrists look at, right?
Yes,
That is, if they're examining a patient, that is one of the things they'll inquire about, true?
yes,
And even in Dr. Borman's reports, he inquires about Mrs. Jensen's family history, correct?
yes,
And that likely was one of the reasons that he would make such inquiries, because she reported some depression and he wanted to find out what else had gone on in her family, correct?
possibly.
And there's indication in his notes that her mother was an alcoholic, correct?
I read that somewhere. I'm not sure that I saw it in his notes. If you want to refer me to which date, I know I saw that somewhere.
In the September 21st, 1998 note.
Oh, I just found the word depressed and Prozac for your earlier questions, and now I'm looking for alcoholic and I can't find it.
So the September 21st note indicates that Julie Jensen reported to Dr. Borman that she was depressed, correct?
All I see is tired, depressed, and Prozac. That's all I can read.
There seems to be an indication that she told him she was tired and depressed and she previously had been on Prozac.
It's one possibility, yeah.
And that would indicate that she was reporting in September that she was depressed, and she reported in December she was depressed.
I'm not sure if she's reporting she was depressed at that time or if she had been depressed in the past. It's not clear to me.
That would be significant, though, in determining how serious her depression may have been in December, correct?
I would take it into consideration.
In evaluating suicide risk, you want to look at how long-standing a depression issue is in the patient, true?
I would take that into consideration, yes.
you didn't inquire of Dr. Borman as to whether he believed that depression had persisted over the course of several months.
No, I didn't.
And you never had Dr. Paul DeFazio's counseling notes for Julie Jensen from 1990 and 1991.
No, I didn't. I'd be happy to read them now.
Well, maybe what we'll do is at the break, I'll let you review those. You never spoke with Mark Jensen regarding his observations of his wife, right?
No.
Fair to say that a spouse is often in better position than neighbors to evaluate the mental condition of their spouse?
It depends upon the relationship between the spouses. I can't really answer that.
Would you say that a person who sees another person daily is more likely to be in position to evaluate their mental health than a person who sees them periodically out in the yard and waves to them?
They would be in a better position to evaluate, but I'm not sure about being able to diagnose or report.
Well, you understand, you didn't understand any of the neighbors to be issuing a diagnosis here, did you?
That's true.
Right?
No.
And Mr. You read a number of police reports in which Mr. Jensen talked to the police, correct?
I think I read one.
What do you have? Tell me. Could you please tell me what reports you have that you've reviewed in which Mr. Jensen was interviewed by police?
I think I have Detective Ratsburg's. I think I read Detective Ratsburg's interview, but I don't have that.
That is, there was what you understand to be approximately a 7-hour interview, correct?
Yes.
And there's a 221-page transcript associated with that
Yes.
interview? You read that interview?
I believe I did.
And you relied on some of that information that's contained therein?
Yes. I don't recall much of it.
When you first formulated your opinions in this case, that document was fresher in your mind, though, fair to say?
Probably.
Do you recall that Mark Jensen, like the neighbors, also was giving what his observations were of his wife's situation over the months preceding her death, true?
Objection calls for hearsay, Your Honor.
Something that she relies on under 90703.
The objection's overruled.
Yes.
Did you find these neighbors to be particularly close friends of Mrs. Jensen?
My impression was that certainly Mr. Voigt was.
Well, what kinds of social things did Mr. Voigt and Mrs. Jensen do during the preceding 6 years?
They spoke a lot.
And it turns out that in the couple months before Julie Jensen passed away, she spoke with Mr. Voigt on almost a daily basis, correct?
That's what I understand.
About very confidential and private matters, correct?
Yes.
Talked to him about her sex life.
I believe mention was made of that. I think,
And Mr. Voigt, your understanding from your review of the reports in this case, that was a significant change in their relationship, true?
in Julie and Mark's relationship?
Between Julie Jensen and Ted Voigt.
I don't remember. I'm sorry.
Well, that is, it was not your understanding, was it, that Julie Jensen had been telling intimate, private details of her life on a daily basis to Mr. Voigt for a period of years?
I don't have any evidence of that. I don't know if it's true or not.
From Mr. Voigt's statement, it appears that was a development of recent origin, true?
I don't remember. I'd have to look at the statement again.
You have no way of knowing whether Julie Jensen's complaints to Mr. Voigt were true, correct?
I have no way of knowing anything is true if you want to, split hairs. I did not interview Mr. Voigt. I did not administer a lie detector test.
Well, and setting aside what Mr. Voigt has to say, you don't know whether Julie Jensen was telling him things that were true, correct?
All I can say is I assumed these things to be true.
How did you reconcile the fact that Julie Jensen was telling things to the Voigts and to Ms. DeFazio that were polar opposites?
I didn't know she was.
Well, do you recall her telling Ms. DeFazio that Mark was controlling because he didn't want her to get a job and she wanted to get a job?
I think I remember her telling her, I think I remember Mrs. Jensen telling Ms. DeFazio that Mark was controlling.
And do you recall that example of that being that Mark would not let her get a job?
I don't remember that part.
Do you have Ms. DeFazio's letter in your materials?
I do.
Could you please review that?
Let's see.
Did you find it?
I have several things that are attributed to her. I've got a list of admissible statements. I've got an interview that's been transcribed, and I've got statements to Detective Ratzberg.
Looking for a 12/4/1998 typewritten statement.
Admissible, there's, here,
It's this, yeah. And let me,
okay. She also indicated that she was thinking of getting a part-time job while her son Doug was in preschool, but didn't know if her husband would allow it.
she told the Voigts that are to the contrary, that her husband was insisting that she get a job, right?
I think so.
She told Ms. DeFazio in the paragraph that's above the one I just showed you that her husband would always turn off or cover the computer quickly. You recall that?
Yes.
She told the Voigts that he'd leave things on the computer for her to see.
Objection,
True.
Your Honor. That's a mischaracterization of Mr. Voigt's testimony.
Well, if you take a look at Mr. Voigt's statement, or I'll
Your Honor, Mr. White testified in this court.
But it's not what Mr. White said, it's what Doctor is relying upon in reaching a conclusion in what she read. The objection's overruled.
I think I remember Mr. Voigt saying something like that.
You were aware that Ms. DeFazio offered Julie Jensen assistance and suggested that she go to Women's Horizon.
Yes,
Julie Jensen failed to accept that help, right?
yes,
You are aware that Julie Jensen, on the day before she died, called up Mrs. Voigt in the morning, right?
yes,
She told Mrs. Voigt words to the effect of, "Don't worry if you don't see me today, I'm fine," correct?
I think it was, "Don't worry if you don't see me, I'm sick."
But I'll be fine, right?
I don't know if she said, "I'll be fine."
Well, she discouraged her from worrying, right?
It sounds as though she didn't want her to worry.
And she also was telling her she didn't need to come help her, right?
I believe so.
You mentioned that one thing you relied on is some information that Julie Jensen was having trouble breathing or coughing on Wednesday morning.
Yes,
Mrs. Voigt talked to her on the phone, correct?
yes,
Mrs. Voigt reported no coughing or trouble breathing or anything else, right?
she didn't.
She just reported that her voice sounded a little bit intoxicated or weak, right?
She said, I don't remember the exact words, but she, I mean, the inference was that she sounded drunk.
And so one possibility is that other reporters who described her as coughing on Wednesday were wrong, and that coughing and trouble and difficulty breathing was on Thursday rather than Wednesday, right?
I don't remember anything said about coughing except by the defendant. But I do recall testimony by Mrs. Jensen's son, David's friend, that David related that his mother was breathing heavily that morning on Wednesday.
Well, do you recall that reports, and that's what you understand the testimony was of someone who's 17 years old testifying about something that occurred when he was 8, right? David's friend, Eric?
Yes.
At the time of the event, within a week or so after Julie Jensen passed away, Detective Ratzberg talked with Eric Shore's mother, Laura Shore, correct?
I don't know.
Well, do you have Detective Ratzberg's report?
I only have part of it.
Let me show you Defendant's Exhibit 219. It's a 2-page portion of Detective Ratsberg's report. I'd ask you to read the last 2 lines on the first page and the rest of the paragraph at the top of the next page.
Sure. Okay, I've read it.
Just one moment, sorry.
And it's the case that within 1 week after Mrs. Jensen's death, the report was that Mrs. Jensen was having a hard time breathing, and that was either on Wednesday or Thursday, correct?
That's what the report says.
Given Mrs. Voigt's statement that she talked to her on the telephone and she did not report any breathing difficulties, makes more sense that that was actually Thursday rather than Wednesday, true?
I don't think so.
What other evidence is there that she was having breathing problems on Wednesday morning?
Because Wednesday morning, a note was written excusing David from something after school, and mention was made by the friend that this had occurred that morning.
Well, that was a 8-year-old boy reporting 9 years later when he was 17, which day it was on, correct?
I think he reported it the next day to Mrs. DeFazio.
Well, that's Mrs. DeFazio's recollection 9 years later.
Yes.
The mother of Eric Shore, in this report, just a few days later, says it was Wednesday or Thursday, correct?
Correct.
And would you ever expect David to leave school early in the morning, say around 8 a.m., 7:30 a.m., and Julie having breathing problems, and then her calling Mrs. Voigt at 9:30 or 10 and not having breathing problems, and then the breathing problems coming back?
I think it's possible.
On what textbook anywhere says that stage 2 comes and goes like that?
No textbook says that. It says that phases may not be clinically apparent. It says that they may be fluid, that they may be overlapping. And so I don't find that inconsistent with her being in stage 2 of ethylene glycol poisoning.
Now, Mrs. Voigt is reporting intoxication, right?
Yes.
That sounds like stage 1, correct?
Yes.
She's not reporting any coughing, which sounds like it's not stage 2, true?
Not at that point.
And she reported that very week, within 2 days, to Detective Ratsberg, the nature of her conversation with Mrs. Jensen and Mrs. Jensen's condition during that phone call, correct?
I can't remember when she reported it.
Are you aware of any police interview with David within a week or so of his mother's death in which anybody tried to establish with any kind of certainty when he saw certain things with his mother?
I know that David was interviewed by the Pleasant Prairie Police, but I don't know when it was, and I have not read that interview.
That was after Mark Jensen's recorded interview the following April, correct?
I don't remember.
In terms of your experience with ethylene glycol, you've had 3 prior cases, is that right?
It's 4 now.
3 of those at least were suicides?
Yes. If I recall correctly, I believe they were.
ethylene glycol is not an uncommon way to commit suicide?
I would say it's relatively uncommon.
But you've had them in Milwaukee County, in Waukesha County, you're aware of them in the past 5 years in Kenosha County.
Yes.
Have you ever treated someone who is alive who is suffering from ethylene glycol poisoning?
No.
Have you ever seen anyone who had ethylene glycol poisoning who is alive?
No.
Have you ever seen how they act when they're at certain stages?
No.
Have you ever been able to compare how somebody might respond to 50 milliliters versus 100 milliliters versus 200 milliliters of ethylene glycol?
By personal observation, no.
Let's take a break at this point. Please don't talk about the case during the break.